The night air over the French coastline carried a cold stillness that made every sound feel sharper than it should have been. Even the distant crash of waves against the rocks seemed too loud, echoing faintly across the darkened shoreline as Allied forces prepared for another quiet insertion behind enemy lines. It was not the kind of battlefield most soldiers imagined when they thought of war. There were no tanks rolling forward, no artillery barrages lighting the sky. Instead, there was only darkness, silence, and the steady awareness that somewhere ahead, hidden among stone walls and ruined farm buildings, German defenders were waiting. The British commandos moved carefully through the low brush just beyond the dunes, their shapes barely visible against the dim horizon. Each man carried only what he needed: light weapons, minimal equipment, and the kind of discipline that came from months of specialized training. These were not conventional infantry. They were trained for something more precise, more controlled. Raids, infiltration, silence. Among them was Corporal James Hensley, a quiet soldier who had learned early that survival in this kind of work depended less on speed and more on patience. He kept his body low as he advanced, one hand resting lightly on the ground to steady himself against the uneven terrain. Every movement was deliberate. Every step is placed carefully to avoid loose stones or dry branches that might betray their position. Ahead of them, the objective lay somewhere beyond a narrow dirt road that cut through the countryside. Intelligence reports had identified a German machine gun nest positioned near a cluster of farm structures overlooking the road. It was not a large position, just a reinforced emplacement dug into the edge of a stone wall, but it controlled the approach route for any Allied movement in the area. Earlier attempts to approach the position had failed. The machine gun crew had a clear field of fire, and any movement along the road was quickly met with accurate bursts that forced attackers to withdraw. The weapon itself, a German MG-42, was one of the most effective machine guns of the war. Its rate of fire was so high that it produced a distinct tearing sound, a rapid metallic ripping that soldiers quickly learned to recognize and fear. The German crew operating it knew their ground well. They had positioned the weapon to cover the road and the open field beyond, with only a narrow blind spot along the hedgerow that curved behind the stone wall. That blind spot was the only reason the commandos were here. A direct assault would have been costly. The MG-42 could cut down advancing troops in seconds, and the surrounding terrain offered little cover. Instead, the plan relied on something far riskier but potentially far more effective: a silent approach. Hensley shifted slightly as the team halted near the edge of a shallow depression overlooking the road. From here, the outlines of the farm structures ahead were faintly visible against the night sky. One building had partially collapsed, its roof sagging inward from earlier bombardment. The stone wall ran along the edge of the road, its uneven surface broken in places where shells had struck. Somewhere behind that wall, the machine gun waited. The team leader, a lieutenant who had spent weeks studying the area, signaled for the men to hold position. He moved forward slowly, crouching low as he approached the edge of the depression. After a few seconds, he raised his hand again. The faint sound of metal reached them, a short burst of mechanical noise, followed by silence. The MG-42. Even without seeing it, the sound confirmed the intelligence reports. The position was active. Hensley felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came before close-range combat. The kind of fight they were about to enter was different from open battlefield engagements. There would be no long-range exchanges, no time to react once the shooting started. This would be decided in seconds. He reached down and adjusted the weapon slung across his chest. It did not look like much. Compared to the rifles carried by most soldiers, it appeared almost crude, light, compact, and built with a simplicity that had drawn criticism from more traditional units earlier in the war. Some had even dismissed it as unreliable, a weapon produced too quickly and too cheaply to be taken seriously. Among certain troops, it had earned a nickname: a toy gun. Hensley had heard it more than once. But the commandos saw it differently, because in the kind of fight they were about to enter, close, fast, and silent, this weapon had advantages that heavier rifles simply did not. The Sten gun, light enough to carry without slowing movement, simple enough to function even in poor conditions, and capable of delivering rapid bursts of fire at close range. Hensley checked the magazine, ensuring it was seated correctly, then rested his hand lightly on the weapon's grip. Around him, the rest of the team prepared in silence. Each man understood the plan. They would move along the hedgerow, staying within the blind spot behind the stone wall. If they remained undetected, they could reach a position within a few yards of the machine gun nest. From there, the fight would be over almost instantly. If they were discovered before reaching that point, the outcome would be very different. The lieutenant gave a final signal. Move. The commandos slipped forward into the darkness, their shapes disappearing into the shadow of the hedgerow as they began the slow approach toward the machine gun nest. Ahead of them, hidden behind stone and earth, the MG-42 waited, unaware that a weapon once dismissed as a toy was about to decide the outcome of the fight. The hedgerow closed around them like a wall of shadow. Branches, thorns, and thick roots twisted together into a natural barrier that swallowed sound and light, but it also forced the commandos into a slow, deliberate advance. There was no room for speed here. Every movement had to be measured. Every step is placed with care. The ground beneath them was uneven, damp from the night air, and littered with small stones that could betray them with the slightest shift of weight. Hensley moved near the middle of the line, his Sten gun held close to his chest, the metal cool against his hands. The weapon felt almost too light for what lay ahead. Compared to the long rifles carried by standard infantry, it lacked weight, lacked the solid reassuring feel of a traditional firearm. That was why so many had dismissed it. Too simple, too crude, too unreliable. A toy gun. But in the narrow darkness of the hedgerow, none of that mattered. What mattered was that it could fire quickly, and that it could be brought up and used in an instant. Ahead of him, the lieutenant moved with controlled precision, pausing every few steps to listen. The rest of the team mirrored his rhythm, stopping when he stopped, moving when he moved. The entire line advanced as one quiet shape, slipping along the blind side of the German position. The sound of the machine gun came again. A short burst. Sharp. Violent. Suddenly, the MG-42 tore through the night with its distinctive ripping sound. A burst fired toward some unseen movement farther down the road. The sound seemed to cut the darkness open, echoing across the fields before fading just as quickly. Then silence returned. But the silence felt different now. Tighter. Closer. Hensley could feel how near they were. The machine gun nest was no longer a distant objective. It was somewhere just beyond the stone wall ahead, separated from them by only a few yards of earth and broken rock. The lieutenant dropped to one knee and raised his hand. The line froze instantly. Hensley lowered himself slowly, his shoulder brushing against the rough bark of the hedge. He could hear something now beyond the wall. Voices. Low, indistinct, spoken in German. The machine gun crew. They were closer than expected. The lieutenant leaned forward slightly, peering through a narrow gap in the hedgerow where the branches thinned. For several seconds he remained still, studying the position ahead. Then he shifted back and gave a series of quiet hand signals. The plan had changed. The original approach point, where they had intended to cross toward the machine gun, was no longer viable. The German crew had positioned themselves closer to that angle than intelligence had suggested. They would have to move even closer. Closer than comfort allowed. Closer than safety. The new route would bring them along the very edge of the stone wall itself, using its shadow to conceal their movement. It also meant that if they were detected, the distance between them and the MG-42 would be almost nothing. Hensley felt his grip tighten slightly on the Sten. At that range, there would be no time to think, only to act. The lieutenant gave the signal again. Forward. The commandos resumed their advance, this time even slower than before. The hedgerow thinned as they approached the stone wall, forcing them into a tighter formation. The smell of damp earth mixed with something sharper now, the faint metallic scent of spent ammunition drifting from the German position. Hensley could hear more clearly now. The shifting of boots against gravel. The quiet clink of metal. A soldier adjusting the machine gun. They were just on the other side. A sudden noise broke the rhythm. A loose stone shifted under one of the commandos farther back in the line. It was small, barely more than a scrape, but in the stillness of the night, It sounded loud. Too loud. Everything stopped. The German voices fell silent instantly. Hensley felt his pulse spike as he pressed himself lower against the ground, his body going completely still. Around him, the rest of the team froze in place, every man holding his breath. From beyond the wall, there was movement. A chair scraping, boots shifting. Then the metallic sound of the MG-42 being lifted slightly. The German crew had heard something. A shadow moved across the top edge of the wall as one of the soldiers stepped closer, his silhouette briefly visible against the dim sky. Hensley could see the outline of his helmet. The man paused, listening. The distance between them now was no more than a few yards. Hensley's finger rested lightly against the trigger of the Sten. He did not raise the weapon yet. Not unless he had to. Because if a shot was fired now, too early, too exposed, the machine gun would open up instantly, and the narrow hedgerow would become a killing zone. The German soldier leaned slightly over the wall, peering into the darkness of the hedgerow. For a moment that seemed to stretch endlessly, neither side moved. The entire operation balanced on the edge of a single decision. Then, slowly, the soldier straightened. A quiet word was spoken back toward the machine gun position. The tension broke. The MG-42 was lowered again. The voices resumed, quieter now, but no longer alarmed. Hensley exhaled slowly, barely allowing the breath to escape. They had not been discovered, but they were now as close as they could possibly get. The lieutenant turned his head slightly, just enough for the men behind him to see the next signal. Prepare. The final movement would be fast. There would be no more creeping forward. No more waiting. From here, the fight would begin in seconds. Hensley adjusted his grip on the Sten, raising it slightly now, the barrel angled toward the top of the wall. For a weapon that many had called a toy, it suddenly felt like the only thing standing between silence and chaos. On the other side of the stone wall, the MG-42 crew remained unaware. But not for much longer. The lieutenant's hand moved once. That was the signal. Everything that followed happened in seconds. Hensley rose just enough to clear the edge of the stone wall, the Sten already coming up into position as his body moved forward with controlled aggression. There was no more stealth now, no more careful placement of steps. The moment for silence had passed. This was the point where speed replaced caution, where hesitation meant death. He saw the machine gun nest instantly. The MG-42 was set low behind a shallow dug position reinforced with sandbags and loose stones. 2 German soldiers were closest to the weapon. One seated behind it, the other crouched beside an ammunition belt feeding into the gun. A third man stood slightly behind them, turning at the sudden movement as the Commandos appeared over the wall. For a fraction of a second, both sides froze. The German gunner's hands were still on the weapon. Hensley's finger tightened on the trigger. The Sten erupted. The burst was short, sharp, and violent in the confined space. The weapon's distinctive stuttering recoil pushed lightly against his grip as a stream of rounds tore across the machine gun position at point-blank range. The first burst struck the gunner before he could react. The second swept across the assistant beside him. The third soldier turned fully, his eyes wide with shock as the sudden eruption of fire shattered the stillness of the night. He tried to reach for his rifle, but the distance was too small, the moment too fast. Another commando fired from Hensley's left. The fight was over almost as soon as it began. The MG-42 fell silent. For a brief second, the only sound was the echo of gunfire bouncing off the stone wall and the nearby structures. Then everything stopped. Hensley stepped forward quickly, keeping the Sten trained on the position as he scanned for movement. The machine gun lay twisted slightly to one side, its barrel still smoking faintly from earlier bursts. The ammunition belt hung loose across the ground, half fed into the weapon. No return fire, no movement. The nest was neutralized. Behind him, the rest of the Commandos moved into the position with practiced efficiency. One man covered the road while another checked the surrounding structures for additional defenders. The lieutenant stepped over the low wall and into the emplacement, his eyes moving quickly across the scene. "Clear," he said quietly. The word carried weight. This position had stopped previous attempts cold. It had controlled the road, denied movement, and forced Allied units to reroute or withdraw. Now it had been silenced in less than 10 seconds. Hensley lowered the Sten slightly, his breathing steady but heavy from the sudden surge of adrenaline. He looked down at the weapon in his hands for a brief moment. Simple, light, crude, some had said. A toy gun. But in this kind of fight, in the darkness at this distance, none of that mattered. What mattered was that it had fired when it needed to, and that it had ended the threat before the machine gun could even respond. The lieutenant knelt briefly beside the MG-42, inspecting it out of instinct. The weapon itself was intact, its metal still warm. The position had been well prepared, with spare ammunition stacked neatly nearby and a clear field of fire covering the road. If the Commandos had been detected even seconds earlier, the outcome would have been very different. The MG-42 could have torn through the hedgerow, cutting them down before they ever reached the wall. But war often turned on moments like this. Seconds, angles, timing, and sometimes the difference between survival and failure came down to the weapon in a soldier's hands. A faint sound came from the distance. Engines. The lieutenant looked up immediately. "Move," he said. There was no time to linger. The machine gun nest had been the objective, but holding the position was not part of the plan. German reinforcements would respond quickly once the silence of the MG-42 was noticed. The Commandos began pulling back almost as quickly as they had arrived. One man grabbed a handful of ammunition from the position while another kicked dirt over parts of the emplacement, disrupting it just enough to prevent immediate reuse. Hensley stepped back over the wall, the Sten still in his hands as he took one last look at the now silent machine gun. Moments earlier it had dominated the road. Now it was just another piece of metal in the dark. The team moved back into the hedgerow, disappearing once again into the shadows as they retraced their approach route. Behind them, the silence of the position felt almost unnatural. No more bursts, no more tearing sounds cutting through the night. Just the distant echo of waves and the faint rustle of wind moving through the fields. The lieutenant paused briefly as the team regrouped in the cover of the hedgerow. "Good work," he said quietly. No one responded. They didn't need to. Each man understood what had just happened. A position that had resisted direct assault had been eliminated with precision and speed. And at the center of it, a weapon many had once dismissed as unreliable had done exactly what it was meant to do. Hensley adjusted the sling on his shoulder as they began moving again. The Sten rested lightly against his chest, no heavier than before. But it no longer felt like something anyone would call a toy. They had barely covered 30 yards along the hedgerow when the first sign of reaction came. At first it was subtle, a distant shout carried across the fields, sharp and questioning. Then another voice answered, louder this time, edged with urgency. The silence left behind by the MG-42 had been noticed. In a defensive line built around overlapping fields of fire, a machine gun did not simply stop without drawing attention. Its absence created a gap, and gaps in war were dangerous. The lieutenant didn't slow. "Keep moving," he said under his breath. The Commandos pressed deeper along the hedgerow, their earlier careful stealth now replaced with controlled speed. They were no longer trying to remain invisible, they were trying to stay ahead of the reaction. Behind them, the German position was beginning to wake. A flare shot into the sky. It burst above the fields in a harsh white glow, spilling cold light across the countryside. The darkness that had protected them moments ago vanished instantly, replaced by sharp shadows and exposed ground. Hensley felt the change immediately. There was nowhere to hide in the open light. The hedgerow still offered some cover, but gaps between its tangled branches now glowed under the flare's illumination. Any movement too close to those openings could be seen from a distance. "Down," the lieutenant ordered. The team dropped instinctively, pressing themselves into the base of the hedge as the flare drifted slowly downward, its light sweeping across the ground like a searching eye. From behind them came the unmistakable metallic clatter of weapons being readied. Then shouting. German soldiers were converging on the machine gun nest. A burst of rifle fire cracked through the night, followed by another. Not aimed yet. More like probing shots, fired toward the hedgerow in response to movement they couldn't fully see. Hensley tightened his grip on the Sten, his eyes scanning through the branches ahead. The weapon felt different now, not just a tool for silent engagement, but something that might have to carry them through a running fight. The flare began to fade. Darkness returned in fragments, shadows reclaiming the ground inch by inch. "Move," the lieutenant whispered. They rose and pushed forward again. Faster now. Behind them, the German voices grew louder. Orders were being shouted. Boots struck gravel and hard ground as troops moved quickly toward the silenced position. A machine gun opened fire. Not the MG-42 they had destroyed, but another weapon positioned farther along the defensive line. Its bursts tore across the fields in sweeping arcs, searching for movement along the hedgerow. Rounds snapped through branches above the Commandos, sending splinters and leaves down around them. They had been located. "Break left," the lieutenant ordered sharply. The team shifted direction immediately, cutting away from the direct line of the machine gun fire and moving toward a lower section of ground where the hedgerow dipped into a shallow drainage path. Hensley followed closely, his boots slipping slightly on the damp earth as they descended into the depression. The ground here was uneven and muddy, but it offered better concealment than the exposed hedge line above. More flares went up. The sky lit again, brighter this time. German soldiers had begun sweeping the area systematically. From the edge of the depression, Hensley could see movement now. Figures spreading out along the field behind them, rifles raised, scanning for the attackers who had just eliminated the machine gun nest. One of the Germans spotted something. A shout. Then gunfire. Bullets tore into the edge of the drainage path, kicking up dirt just yards from the Commando's position. The lieutenant didn't hesitate. "Return fire." Hensley raised the Sten and fired. The weapon rattled in his hands, short bursts cutting through the air as he aimed toward the muzzle flashes in the distance. The recoil was light, controllable, allowing him to fire quickly and adjust without losing balance in the uneven ground. Other Commandos joined in. Rifles cracked. Another Sten fired in sharp bursts. The exchange was brief but intense, both sides firing more to suppress than to hit, each trying to gain a moment of advantage. Then the lieutenant signaled again. "Move." They couldn't stay. The longer they remained in one place, the more the Germans would close in. The Commandos pushed forward along the drainage path, staying low as they moved through the shallow depression. The sound of pursuit followed behind them now. Shouting, boots, the occasional burst of gunfire. But the distance between them was holding. Hensley's breathing had grown heavier, not from panic but from the sustained pace and the constant tension of the fight. He kept the Sten ready, glancing back occasionally to ensure no one was closing too fast. Ahead, the terrain began to rise slightly. The hedgerow thickened again, forming a denser barrier that curved away from the German line. Beyond it lay open ground leading back toward the extraction point. The lieutenant slowed just enough to regroup the team. "Last stretch," he said. No one replied. They didn't need to. The hardest part was over. But it wasn't finished. Behind them, the German search continued, but it was no longer coordinated. Without the machine gun nest controlling the road, the defensive line had lost one of its key anchors. The response was reactive now, scattered, lacking the precision that had made the position so effective earlier. The Commandos slipped through the final section of hedgerow and into the darker stretch of open ground beyond. No flares reached this far. No machine gun covered this angle. For the first time since the assault began, there was space. Distance. The lieutenant raised his hand. The team slowed, then stopped. Silence returned gradually, broken only by distant shouting far behind them and the faint echo of sporadic gunfire. They had made it out. Hensley lowered the Sten slightly, his grip relaxing as the immediate threat faded. The weapon hung lightly in his hands, no different in weight or shape than it had been before. But everything about it felt different now. Behind them, the machine gun nest remained silent. Ahead, the night stretched open once again. And somewhere along that hedgerow, a position that had once dominated the road had been erased in seconds, by a weapon many had once dismissed without understanding where it truly belonged. By the time the Commandos reached the coastline again, the first hint of dawn had begun to bleed into the horizon. The sky shifted slowly from deep black to a muted gray-blue, revealing the outline of the sea stretching endlessly beyond the narrow strip of land. The same waves that had echoed faintly in the night now rolled more visibly against the rocks, steady and indifferent to what had taken place inland. The team moved the last stretch in silence. No one spoke. The urgency of the escape had faded, replaced by the quiet exhaustion that followed a mission completed under pressure. Boots sank lightly into the damp sand as they crossed the final stretch toward the extraction point, where a small craft waited low in the water, its engine off, barely visible against the early morning light. The lieutenant gave a short signal. The mission was over. One by one, the men climbed aboard, their movements slower now, measured not by caution but by fatigue. The boat pushed off quietly, its engine coming to life only once enough distance had been placed between them and the shoreline. Hensley sat near the edge, the Sten resting across his lap as the craft cut through the water. For a while he simply looked back. The coastline grew smaller with each passing minute, the fields and hedgerows fading into a distant blur. Somewhere beyond that horizon line, the machine gun nest they had destroyed lay silent, its field of fire broken, its role in the defensive line erased. To anyone passing by later, it might not look like much. Just another position abandoned. Another small scar in a landscape already marked by war. But the effect of what had happened there would travel farther than the position itself. Without that machine gun covering the road, movement through that sector would become possible again. Units that had been delayed or forced to reroute would find a path open where none had existed before. In a war defined by supply lines, timing, and narrow windows of opportunity, even a single silenced position could shift the rhythm of operations in ways that were not immediately visible. That was the nature of this kind of fighting. Small actions, precise outcomes, and consequences that extended far beyond the moment itself. Hensley glanced down at the Sten in his hands. It looked the same as it always had. A simple metal frame, a side-mounted magazine, no polished finish, no refined design, no sense of craftsmanship that might impress someone unfamiliar with its purpose. It was not a weapon that inspired confidence at first glance. It was not built to. When it had first been introduced, many had dismissed it outright. Compared to the more traditional rifles and submachine guns used by other forces, it seemed too basic, too quickly assembled, too rough in its construction. Stories had spread through units of jams, misfires, and unreliable performance under certain conditions. And so the name had stuck. A toy gun. But names in war often come from misunderstanding. The Sten had never been designed to replace a rifle in open combat. It had never been intended to fight across fields or engage targets at long distances. It was built for something else entirely. Close range, confined spaces, moments where speed mattered more than precision. Moments exactly like the one that had unfolded at the stone wall. There, in the space of a few seconds, everything the weapon had been designed for came into focus. Its light weight allowed it to be raised instantly. Its simplicity meant there was no hesitation, no complication in its use. And its rate of fire, delivered at point-blank range, had ended the fight before the machine gun could respond. No other weapon in that moment would have done the job more effectively. Hensley adjusted the sling slightly as the boat continued moving across the water. He thought briefly of the German gunner behind the MG-42, the way the moment had frozen for just an instant before everything changed. That was the reality of close combat. It wasn't drawn out. It wasn't dramatic in the way people imagined from a distance. It was sudden, decisive, and often finished before either side fully understood what had happened. The lieutenant moved quietly along the length of the boat, checking on each man without speaking. There were no casualties. A few minor scrapes, dirt, exhaustion, but nothing more. For a mission that could have ended in seconds of chaos and loss, that alone was enough. The coastline had nearly disappeared now, swallowed by distance and morning light. Behind them, the war continued. Elsewhere, artillery would still be firing. Tanks would still be advancing. Entire divisions would still be moving across fields and roads far larger than the narrow strip of land they had just left behind. But for a brief moment in that larger conflict, something precise had been achieved. A single position, once feared and effective, had been removed, and the weapon that had done it, dismissed, underestimated, overlooked, had proven its worth in the only way that mattered. Not through reputation, not through design, but through the result. The engine hummed steadily as the boat carried them farther out to sea. Hensley rested his hand lightly on the Sten one last time before letting it settle against his side. No one would call it a toy again, not after that night.